Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Lauren Hunt, and I am an infectious disease pharmacist by training and serve as the Director of Antimicrobial Stewardship for the western half of the U.S. for bioMérieux. I'm very excited to be joined by Dr. Peter Beyer, who's one of the senior advisors to the World Health Organization. Dr. Beyer, could you please introduce yourself and tell us about your role at the WHO?
Yeah, thank you so much, Lorraine, for having me, and I'm very excited as well. As you said, I'm working at the World Health Organization in the division on antimicrobial resistance, and in that division, I'm leading a team that is working on research coordination and fostering development of new antibiotics and global initiatives in other areas as well. So that can include animal health, but also shortages of existing antibiotics, for example.
Absolutely, and that is something that has certainly a lot of those probably listening have experienced in their day-to-day practice. I know it was something that we had weekly meetings about with shortages, and that is also can lead to what, our antimicrobial resistance problem when we don't have the best agent to treat the infection at hand. So we know that there are quite a few statistics and numbers that represent not only the impact, but then what the future threat could be on a lot of the antimicrobial resistance metrics that surround us. So to put it simply, the bugs just really continue to outsmart us, and we're running out of antimicrobials. So I'm going to jump to the topic that is at the front of everybody's mind and has really impacted everybody over the last 10 to 12 months of COVID-19. So this disease, much like many others, impacts the whole world, but it does it different regionally. So with AMR, we see different resistance mechanisms in different parts of the world. And with COVID-19, we've seen great infection prevention and control. And then we've also seen a lot of fluctuations. So I think COVID-19 is actually maybe presenting a really good example of public health concern. And the urgency has really pushed us to develop new diagnostics, new surveillance, new technologies. So that being said, what has COVID-19 taught us about antimicrobial resistance and surveillance?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I think, what it certainly taught us that it is that the world can really mobilize against a pandemic. And the question that I'm asking myself, well, why didn't we do nearly as much against antimicrobial resistance? Although we know for years now that it's killing thousands of people every year, then it's going to get worse. How can we actually get, yes, a similar mobilization around fighting AMR as we did for COVID-19. And as you said, there are similar issues. Infection prevention and control. This is one of the cheapest, most efficient measures you can take to actually limit, getting new infections with resistant bacteria in hospitals. And that is something which hopefully, and let's see, maybe it's having a positive impact on AMR already, because I'm sure that in many hospitals, you will have actually improved infection prevention and control because of COVID-19. And so I hope that we will learn from that. And maybe similarly also with respect to research and development. We saw it. It can be really fast. It costs an enormous amount of money, but it is possible actually to mobilize resources against a pandemic, and AMR is also a pandemic. It's slower, it's less visible, it is growing constantly over the years, but it is there.
And I've thought about that a lot, and some of my mentors, we've had great conversations about it as well. Because it's slower, the threat doesn't feel like it's there. We've relied on antibiotics for so long. What do you think it'll take for some of our leaders and policymakers to really recognize it like they have COVID-19?
I mean, I don't want to be unfair because we had discussions at the G7 among heads of states, AMR. So we can't even say that the politicians or the governments are not aware and they didn't look into it. And they made efforts and they kept it on the agenda. It's on the agenda of the G20. They continue discussing around it. But I mean, of course, it's so complicated. It's such a wicked problem. For AMR, there's so many things we have to do. We have to look at how to improve the use in animals, how to reduce the use in animals. Then we have to see how we improve actually the appropriate use in humans as well. I mean, there's a lot of abuse or inappropriate use. On the other, and then we have this research and development challenge where the question is, well, can the industry get it done? But how do we get the industry to engage if they feel that there's not enough money to make? So there's so many different facets of the problem that I think from a policy making point of view, it's not that you can adopt a law that is going to solve the AMR issue.
Absolutely. So maybe talking a little bit more with industry. So in one of the publications that you and Dr. Sarah Paulin had recently published, you compared it to the number of chemotherapy agents that are in the pipeline versus the number of antimicrobials. And, you know, a lot of drug makers, they of course want to have the R&D where the money's at. But a lot of times that's with chronic disease states. And with cancer, sometimes it's one treatment and done. So why do you think that we can charge so much more for chemotherapy? Why do you think that the drug industry is so much more motivated to go after that and very, specific mechanisms with cancer versus the specific mechanisms that we do with antimicrobials with infections that could also lead to a long life ahead of someone if we can cure that infection?
Yeah, it's a good question. Of course, I mean, the industry, the whole R&D system as we have it today is a market-driven system. And of course, the companies who are engaged in developing new treatments, they look at the public health importance as well, but they will look at where can we actually get the biggest return on our investment. I mean, there are many reasons why cancer, for example, is more attractive. If you develop a new antibiotic for all these bacterial infections, we do have a cure. We do have an antibiotic which in 90% of the cases it actually cures the infection. So if you want to develop a new antibiotic, you are competing against a cure, and it's really bloody difficult to be better than a cure. So you have to really show that your antibiotic either is faster, less side effects, overcomes resistance, but then it's only used for the resistant infections, so only maybe for 5, 10, 20% of the cases. So it's really, really difficult to make money. I mean, and also scientifically, you first have to develop such an antibiotic, which it is really challenging. And for cancer, unfortunately, for many of the cancers, we don't have really good treatments. We have treatments that take a long time, have a lot of side effects, cure a number of the patients, but not all. Patients relapse. So let's say scientifically, there's more room for improvement.
Okay.
And of course, the case numbers are extremely high. And typically, cancer treatments, you can justify a high price for reimbursement. While for antibiotics, typically you would be compared against the existing generic treatment, and then your price is fixed in comparison to the existing generic treatment, which is a low-priced product. And so it's a whole system on how we do the reimbursement. And of course, in principle, it's correct if you say, well, we have a generic treatment that cures patients. Why would we pay a premium for something new, which is not really so much better? But if you have this problem of resistance, there is a reason why you need constantly new antibiotics coming to the market that may be not so much better, but that we still need, because the old antibiotics, they will at one point in time not work anymore. And that is an evolution that the current system doesn't really take into account, and only now countries like Germany, they change the system, how they set the prices for new antibiotics, take into account actually that resistance is a very important criterion also when they fix the new price for a new antibiotic.
Absolutely. And I know that here in the US, there are quite a few pieces of legislation that we're trying to push through. One of my senators actually here in Colorado was one that introduced it. So it's great, to, like we've talked about, it's great to see that progress. There still is a long road ahead of us, but I think that seeing the transition, because maybe to our point earlier, this problem of AMR, it is slow, it is the organism's constantly changing. It's not something that's so fast onset like we saw with the recent pandemic. So I'm really glad that we're starting to see some more proactive approaches to AMR. So speaking of proactive, I kind of wanted to touch on the article that was in the New York Times that talked a little bit more about the AMR fund that you helped lead to develop. So the WHO, led by you, is now collaborating with about 20 different pharmaceutical companies around the world that are going to fund small and medium-sized companies to really engage their efforts and allow them to continue the development of new antimicrobials. So I believe it said we're hoping for about 2 to 4 over the next decade to get to market. Can you just talk about what that process was like, getting so many people to the table to have this important discussion to continue the innovation?
Yeah, I think this is really exciting news, in particular this year where so much focusing on COVID-19, that we're getting this AMR Action Fund that is going to pump $1 billion into antibiotic development, focusing on the phase 2, phase 3, which are the most expensive clinical phases. And it's also very encouraging that this money actually comes from the industry. As you said, it's 20 companies putting up the money, and they are also at the moment putting up the fund. And you asked how it came about. For 18 months or so, that with the European Investment Bank, we were discussing this idea. We had a concept. We mandated a company to do an economic model on how such an impact investment fund could work for antibiotic development. So, I mean, we knew that you can use this instrument. But of course, with all these instruments, I mean, somebody has to come up with the money. And that is where I think it was the IFPMA, it was Thomas Courney who looked at this idea. They looked at other ideas, and he brought together this coalition of companies and said, well, he convinced them that it's a good idea to each put up some money and put it together in one pot and try to do something actually to reinvigorate the antibiotic development. And so I think it's a really fascinating initiative, and it's going to buy us some time, but it will not replace the need for actually better reimbursement of new antibiotics.
Absolutely, yeah, and I'm really excited to see how that continues to progress, because like you said, not everybody, we don't need that type of like carve out for every treatment, whether if basic amoxicillin, we don't need that type of carve out. But when we do have these infections that we just haven't come up against in the past, that we haven't created legislation and insurance policies around, so I think that that's a really great thought. Something else I wanted to talk about was the role that diagnostics play in this. So in order to know what infection the patient has, we need to understand what mechanisms of resistance, whether it's genetics or actually getting the susceptibilities. Have you guys had any conversations around that in these discussions about how diagnostics plays a role in the drug development for AMR?
Yeah, as you said, that is a key question, and it's not an easy one. I'll bring one example. We have set up a foundation in Geneva, the Global Antibiotic R&D Partnership, GARD-P, and they are developing together with industry a couple of these key missing antibiotics. And one they are working on when they are in phase 3 is a new drug against gonorrhea, which is against resistant gonorrhea. It's a new first-in-class treatment. And now the big question is, of course, well, how do we roll it out? I mean, if we have a new treatment against gonorrhea, and we know that in some countries you may have 2, 3, 5, 10, we don't know how much resistance. It depends on the country. But how do you make sure that the new treatment is only used for the resistant cases? So you have to launch this product with a cheap, fast point of care diagnostic to ensure, in particular in low and middle income countries, that it's actually used appropriately. Because you don't want, if you make it a first line treatment, you will burn it in 5 years.
Yep.
I mean, I say 5 years. I'm not an expert, but you will burn it fast.
You know, the second you introduce a new drug is when you see the resistance. We learned that many years ago from Fleming. So, and I think that that's a really interesting perspective, especially in something like gonorrhea. We know that the resistance is on the rise, but you think about how many tests the world does on a daily basis for chlamydia and gonorrhea. You know, most of them, it's a combined test that they do for the two of them. So to be able to parse out and look at the risk factors for resistance to be able to use that agent, it's certainly a challenge we see with all organisms, but in something like gonorrhea, especially when STD rates are on the rise, who needs this type of diagnostic the most? And I think, you know, we talk a lot about antibiotic stewardship, but the diagnostic stewardship is also just as important. So I appreciate your perspective on that. So I guess moving into, you know, we've talked about so many of the great successes and the great steps, getting funding. This is, you know, now it's international collaboratives, because we know that infections know no borders. So what do you see as some of the greatest challenges in these innovative treatments? You know, not all are run-of-the-mill antimicrobials. We have phages and all different types of things that are in the pipeline. Are there obstacles that you see for some of these new treatments getting to market? And if so, how do we continue to mold and reflex to that?
Yeah, it's of course very exciting to see all these innovative new approaches in the pipeline. As you said, the phages. We are seeing also a lot of approaches that are trying to address one specific pathogen. So we are very curious to see how they will evolve over time in the drug development. I mean, they are of course associated with some challenges. If you have one, you know, if you have a very narrowly focused antibiotic which is targeting one pathogen, you again need a very good diagnostics, because otherwise, I mean, it will be very difficult to use. For the phages, of course, the challenge is that you need to get I call it like a generic cocktail. You can't, I mean, if you have to do it for every patient individually, it will be very difficult to scale it, in particular in low and middle income countries. But I'm sure these are obstacles that can be overcome, and that's where I think we have to invest in these new approaches. And it's with all these risky scientific processes, you have to invest in 10 to get one through at the end. And so we are very interested to see how all these CARBX projects are developing now over the clinical phases.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I greatly appreciate so many of the thoughts that were brought forward in this. And I'd like to move into talking about action a little bit. So we've mentioned some of the great steps that have already been taken, but outside of drug development, what types of investments do you think we need to make in order to have meaningful improvement in AMR around the world? And that can be related to everyday stewardship, what meat I purchase at the grocery store, to academia, to clinical practice. Is there anything that stands out to you, a handful of things that we need to do in order to fight this as a society?
Yeah, I mean, that's of course a broad question. My older daughter, she tells me, if only we would all become vegetarian, half of the problem would be solved. So, of course, I mean, she's right, huh? But that's probably not going to happen anytime soon, although it's certainly a trend in Europe, and I guess in the United States probably as well. IPC, infection prevention control, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, that's such an easy win. I mean, we know how to do it. We know that it's cost effective, and still it's not easy to. And I think that is where maybe maybe we can become more innovative, how we can incentivize hospitals to really invest in that area. And it's mainly also, it's an investment in human resources. Of course, there's this whole the whole part of using antimicrobials in food production, and that I think there is also there's a lot of room for improvement, and that's where I think sometimes we need certainly more awareness raising, but we need more pressure from the consumer as well, because then it's going to move. And because I think that's where we can also score easy wins in reality if we really get our act together.
I always appreciate outside perspectives to medicine, because in medicine we've done things the same way for so long, especially in infectious diseases. So when someone brings an outside perspective and they're like, why don't we try this? I greatly appreciate that and highly encourage it. So I'm really hopeful that this does teach us a lot of great lessons that we can carry forward and come together as an entire globe to fight antimicrobial resistance and the current pandemic. So with that, I just wanted to thank you again for your time. I know these unprecedented times are certainly pulling at all of our schedules. So thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope you have a wonderful day.